Hi, everybody. So today I'm going to go over or compare viruses and bacteria to one another. Okay, so let's start with their characteristics. Now, viruses, these are non-living. They're acellular structures, meaning they are not made of cells like all living things are. Okay, they can only reproduce when they have a host and they lack cell organelles. Now, bacteria, these are living organisms. They're unicellular, meaning they only have one cell. They can reproduce on their own, and they do have their own organelles. Okay, so let's move on. And now, as far as the structure, viruses are simply composed of genetic material, that's either DNA or RNA, and then they're enclosed in a protein shell, or what's called a capsid. I always think of it kind of like a storage container. It's holding the genetic material in there. Now, some viruses have an additional lipid envelope surrounding that capsid as well. Okay, then we have bacteria. Now, they are a single cell, as we mentioned. They all have cell walls. And like all cells, they do have a cell membrane. They have cytoplasm, ribosomes, and their DNA consists of a single circular chromosome. And now, as far as reproduction, viruses are only able to replicate when they infect a host. They need to use the organelles of that host in order to be able to reproduce. Now, bacteria, they can reproduce on their own. They reproduce asexually by a process called binary fission. And what this does is produces two identical copies of cells. So you can see how quickly they may be able to reproduce if they can double their population every time they reproduce. Now, as far as their genetic material, so as I mentioned, viruses, they contain DNA, or there's also some viruses called retroviruses. They use RNA for their genetic material. Now, bacteria, they have DNA for their genetic material, and now that is a circular chromosome. Okay, and then there's occasionally something called plasmids, which have additional DNA as well. Okay. Now, as far as antibiotics, antibiotics will not affect viruses. So if you have a cold or flu, taking an antibiotic would not help that condition. Now, as far as bacteria, these are what antibiotics target. Okay, so many are killed. Oops, that was a mistake. There we go. Many are killed or at least inhibited by antibiotics, and these antibiotics will target the cell wall or how it produces proteins, for example. Now, antibiotic resistance can be a problem given the high ability of bacteria to reproduce. They can make many copies, and there's a potential for some of those to be resistant to that antibiotic. Okay, so as far as their impact on humans, okay, viruses, they can cause diseases like influenza, HIV, COVID-19, okay, and some of these can be prevented with vaccinations. And there are some biotechnology uses for viruses as well. Now, bacteria, some of them cause infections, such as strep throat, tuberculosis, salmonella, to name just a few. And then there's some beneficial bacteria as well. For example, the ones in our gut, in our digestive system. And then we use some to make things such as yogurt and cheese. So we do find some benefits to bacteria as well. Most bacteria would be harmless to humans. Now, if we compare their size, viruses are much smaller than bacteria, and just for a reference, they're typically between 20 and 300 nanometers, so much smaller than a cell. Now, bacteria, they are larger, but they are a simple cell called prokaryotes. So they're usually approximately about 1 to 5 micrometers. So this does make them a little easier to observe. We can see them under a light microscope, whereas viruses we cannot. Okay, so now we're going to talk about how these two viruses and bacteria are able to reproduce and adapt so quickly. So we'll start with viruses. The retroviruses, again, those are the ones with RNA, mutate very quickly because there is no fact-checking enzymes to correct any mistakes that may be made. The viruses that use DNA can reproduce very quickly as well, so there leads to a high rate mutation rate. But those retroviruses, they're mutating much faster than even than the DNA. Now, bacteria, they certainly mutate quickly because they can reproduce at such a high rate, but it is slightly less than that of viruses. But there's so much replication going on. There's always an opportunity for mistakes that could help benefit that virus or bacteria and make it resistant to any type of treatments we may have. So like we mentioned, they both have those high reproduction rates. Remember, with binary fission in bacteria, they're able to double their population however fast they're able to reproduce under ideal conditions. Now, viruses, some are able to make millions of copies within a single cell, so they certainly have the option or that ability to reproduce very quickly. Within those huge populations, there's bound to be some errors that could end up being beneficial. So the high mutation rate for viruses and as well as replication, that can lead to a resistance to diseases. It could also, for example, jump species and suddenly infect humans or another type of animal or any organism because of those mutations. With bacteria, we always run the risk of that antibiotic resistance, which can make them much more difficult to be treated and keep creating, and they can keep spreading that resistance on if they're able to keep replicating. So hopefully all that information was helpful.